Judge sides against a black woman in court until she reveals she's a U.S. attorney. It was late at night, just past 11, when she was driving her sleek silver car through the quiet streets of the city. The air was cool, carrying a slight chill that made her crack the window open just a little. She had been working all day, exhausted from long hours at the office, but her mind was still sharp. All she wanted was to get home, relax, and finally rest. The soft hum of the engine and the dim streetlights cast long shadows, making the city feel both calm and a little eerie. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appeared behind her. At first, she didn't panic. She knew the routine. Pulling over, hands steady on the steering wheel, she waited quietly. 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached her. Their faces were serious, their eyes watching her, carefully, but there was something more beneath the surface. Suspicion, distrust, judgment. They looked at her, not just as a driver, but in a way that made her skin tighten. The kind of look that said, "You don't belong here," even though she hadn't done anything wrong. The officers saw a black woman driving a luxury car in a neighborhood they didn't expect. That was enough reason for them to stop her. Without any real cause, without any real reason, she kept her composure. Years of experience had taught her how to stay calm in moments like this. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make sudden moves. She simply reached for her registration and license when asked. The officers' questions were sharp, their tone edged with suspicion. They grilled her about where she was coming from, where she was going, if she had been drinking. Every question felt like an accusation, but she said only what she needed to. She answered politely but firmly, careful not to give them any reason to escalate the situation. She didn't tell them who she really was, not yet, because sometimes she knew revealing too much too soon would only make things worse. Inside, her heart was racing. She was angry at the unfairness, at the prejudice. But showing anger wasn't an option. She had to be strategic, patient. She had a plan. The officers weren't just doing their job. They were following a pattern she had seen too many times before. A pattern that targeted people who looked like her, who had to work twice as hard to be seen as equals. She knew the system was broken, rigged to protect those in power and punish those without it. And tonight, she was going to face that system head-on. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror seemed to grow brighter, almost mocking. The city streets, once peaceful, felt oppressive. But she refused to be a victim. This stop was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. She glanced at the officers as they stood near her car. They didn't know she was a federal prosecutor, someone who had spent years fighting injustice in courtrooms. They didn't know she had seen the inside of the system, understood how it worked, and had the courage to expose it. She stayed silent about her identity because she wanted to see what would happen if she simply played the role of another black woman being pulled over. She wanted to experience the truth firsthand and gather the proof she needed. It wasn't easy, but she knew that sometimes the only way to fight the system was from within. As the officers talked between themselves, eyeing her suspiciously, she kept her breathing steady. She remembered every detail, the cold glare of the flashlight shining in her face, the rough way her hands were checked, the way the officers' attitudes shifted when no real excuse for the stop appeared. She knew every moment was a test of her strength and resolve. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about a system that had allowed prejudice and abuse to thrive. A system that protected its own and punished those who dared to challenge it. But tonight, she wasn't going to back down. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows. She felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just driving home. She was driving into a battle that could change everything. This moment, this stop, was the first step toward revealing a truth that many wanted to keep hidden. It was the start of a story about courage, injustice, and the fight for real justice. And she was ready. The night air grew colder as the officers stepped closer to her car. She could feel the tension in the space between them, thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. One officer leaned in with his flashlight, shining the harsh beam into her eyes. It was more than just a light. It was a reminder of who held the power in that moment. "You rolled through the stop sign back there," the officer said, his voice sharp, almost accusing. She knew there hadn't been a stop sign, but she kept, her expression calm and her voice steady. "I made a full stop," she replied, careful with every word. "You can check the traffic cameras if you want." He didn't respond. Instead, another officer circled to the other side of her car, shining his light inside as if searching for something. He smelled her breath and asked if she had been drinking. Again, she said no. She wasn't drunk. She was tired, frustrated, and angry, but never intoxicated. But none of her answers seemed to matter. The officers' minds were made up before the first question had even been asked. They were looking for a reason, any reason, to make this stop count. They wanted control, and they wanted to remind her of her place. Then came the words she had feared but expected. "Step out of the vehicle." The order wasn't a question. It was a demand. She hesitated, knowing her rights, but understanding that arguing here would only escalate things. Slowly, carefully, she opened the door and stepped onto the cold pavement. The gravel under her, shoes felt sharp and uncomfortable, a small reminder of how out of place she was in this moment. Without warning, one of the officers grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back roughly and forcing cold metal cuffs around her wrists. The sharp bite of the handcuffs dug into her skin. The pain was sudden and harsh, but she didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that any sound of pain or distress could be twisted into resistance. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from rage. She had spent years fighting in courtrooms, defending people who faced injustice, and now she was living it herself. The same system she worked to uphold was turning against her. Nearby, other officers were busy. One radioed in a false report about a stolen vehicle, making sure a tow truck would come quickly to impound her car. She watched as the tow truck arrived, within minutes, hooking up her car without even checking the registration. This was no accident. It was a pattern she had seen before. As she was pushed toward the patrol car, she noticed a young man on the sidewalk quietly filming the scene on his phone. The officers spotted him too and immediately threatened him to move along. His hesitation and fear were clear as he backed away, leaving her alone once more. In the back of the patrol car, she sat stiff and cold, the harsh metal bench pressing against her back. The handcuffs were tight, the chill from the night seeping through her thin clothing. Her tank top offered no protection against the cold or the coldness of the system surrounding her. At the police station, the booking process was mechanical and dehumanizing. She was ordered to remove her jewelry, her mother's sapphire ring, a graduation gift she treasured deeply, and her delicate watch, which had timed countless courtroom battles. Each item taken felt like a piece of her identity being stripped. "Wait?" She asked to make a phone call to her attorney, but was denied with the excuse that the phones were down for maintenance. She knew this was a lie, a tactic used to isolate detainees and wear down their spirit. In the holding cell, she was surrounded by women with similar stories. Women pulled over for nothing, arrested on false pretenses, left to wait for hours, or even days without answers. There was a young nurse who had been stopped for a broken taillight that wasn't broken, a woman arrested for running a stop sign that didn't exist, and many others. Listening to their stories, she felt a mix of anger and resolve. These weren't just random mistakes. They were part of a larger system designed to intimidate and silence people who looked like her, who dared to succeed in places they weren't supposed to be. Despite the rough treatment, the injustice, and the cold, she remained calm and focused. She started quietly documenting every detail in her mind. The badge numbers of officers, the exact words they used, the order of events. Every violation, every lie, every abuse of power was a piece of evidence she would use later. Though she was now just another detainee in the eyes of the system, inside she was a fighter. She wasn't going to let this stop define her or break her spirit. This night was painful and unjust, but it was also the beginning of a battle that would expose a deep-rooted corruption and demand real change. As she sat in that cold cell, she made a silent promise. She would tell the truth, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced and pushed aside, for the women in the cell with her, for the countless others who never had the chance to fight back. Tonight, she was caught in the system's web, but she wasn't trapped. She was gathering strength, ready to turn this moment of darkness into a beacon of hope. Even though she was behind bars now, her mind was racing faster than ever. She wasn't just sitting quietly waiting for the next step. She was planning, analyzing, preparing. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of a fight she was determined to win. She hadn't revealed who she was yet, and that was a choice. The officers and the court officials didn't know she was a federal prosecutor, someone trained to understand every legal detail, every loophole, every tactic. She was playing a role, just another person caught in the system's unfair grip. But inside, she was gathering the pieces she would need to bring the whole corrupt network crashing down. Her first court appearance came quickly. The room was cold, the air thick with tension. The judge sat with an air of disinterest, flipping through papers as if this was just another case to be moved along. The prosecutor assigned to her case was sharp and confident, wearing an expensive suit and showing no hesitation in pushing for the harshest bail. The charges were serious: resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, even possession of a stolen vehicle, none of which were true. It was clear from the start that this was a coordinated effort to punish her for pushing back, for simply existing in a space they didn't expect her to be. Her defense attorney tried to argue her innocence, pointing out the lack of probable cause and the obvious bias. But the judge brushed it off, denying motions to dismiss or suppress evidence. It felt like the system was stacked against her at every turn, protecting those who wielded power and dismissing those who questioned it. But she stayed calm. Every word, every gesture was deliberate. She knew that this fight wasn't just about her freedom. It was about exposing a pattern, a system that had been in place for too long. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending all the people who had been targeted and silenced. Behind the scenes, her legal team was working tirelessly. They began gathering evidence, videos, audio recordings, witness statements, everything that would show the truth. They reached out to others who had been stopped or arrested under suspicious circumstances. Slowly but surely, a pattern was emerging. Police officers who stopped mostly minority professionals, targeting them with false accusations. Prosecutors who buried evidence to protect those officers. Judges who dismissed legitimate complaints, keeping the system's abuses hidden. From public view, she was living proof of that system, and now she was determined to tear it apart. Throughout the days in custody, she watched and listened carefully. The way officers treated others, the quiet agreements between them, the way paperwork went missing or was delayed. These were all signs of a deep corruption that went beyond a few bad apples. Her identity as a federal prosecutor was a powerful tool, but she chose to keep it secret for now. She wanted to experience firsthand what so many others endured without the resources or the voice to fight back. She was collecting every detail, every violation, every injustice. Every visit from her attorney was a chance to update on the evidence being gathered, to strategize the next legal moves. Every phone call denied, every delay in processing, every harsh word or unfair decision was documented mentally and physically, stored away like precious evidence. Her resolve only grew stronger with each passing day. The system thought it could break her, make her back down, or force a quick plea deal. But she wasn't here to give up. She was here to fight. She also found unexpected strength in the women around her, the nurse, the teacher, the business owner, each with their own story of wrongful arrest and abuse. Their shared experiences became a quiet bond, a reminder that this was not an isolated problem, but a widespread injustice. She talked quietly with them, encouraging them to hold on, to tell their stories when the time was right. She knew justice wasn't just about winning in court. It was about changing a system that allowed this to happen in the first place. As the court dates approached, she prepared to reveal her identity, not as a last-ditch effort, but as a powerful statement. She was not just another defendant. She was someone who had spent her life fighting for justice. And she was about to use everything she had learned from inside the system to expose its darkest secrets. The day she stood in the courtroom and revealed she was a U.S. attorney, the whole room changed. The smug confidence of the prosecutor vanished, the hardened faces of the officers paled, and even the judge seemed taken aback. Her words carried weight and authority that no one could ignore. That moment marked the beginning of a turning point. FBI agents appeared soon after, serving warrants and arresting those who had abused their power. It was a dramatic shift, the system starting to crack under the pressure of the truth she had gathered. But this was only the start. There were still many battles ahead: investigations, court hearings, reforms. She was ready for all of it, because she knew the fight for real justice was never easy. It required courage, patience, and a willingness to face the darkest parts of the system head-on, and she had all three. After revealing her true identity and sparking a dramatic courtroom shift, the fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Now, the real work had to be done, building a case strong enough to bring down a corrupt system that had been hiding in plain sight for years. She spent every moment she could gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, and connecting the dots. The patterns were clear. Officers who targeted successful professionals from minority communities, prosecutors who quietly buried complaints, and judges who turned a blind eye or actively covered up misconduct. It wasn't just a few bad actors. It was a whole network working together to protect each other and maintain their power. Her days were filled with meetings, reviewing documents, and preparing legal strategies. Her nights were spent going over testimonies and piecing together timelines. Every discarded file, every lost report, every false statement made by officers or officials became a thread she could pull to unravel the whole tangled web of corruption. She wasn't alone. A small but dedicated team of investigators, lawyers, and trusted allies worked alongside her. They combed through hundreds of arrest records, traffic stops, and complaint reports, looking for inconsistencies and signs of misconduct. They found cases where officers made false accusations, used excessive force, or refused to follow proper procedures, cases that had been ignored or swept under the rug for years. One of the most troubling discoveries was how the police department's unofficial quotas pushed officers to meet arrest targets, often by stopping and harassing innocent people. The officers she'd encountered weren't acting on real suspicion. They were playing a game of numbers, prioritizing quantity over justice. Even more disturbing was the evidence showing how certain prosecutors actively worked to suppress any complaints or evidence that could harm the officers' reputations. These prosecutors had close relationships with judges, creating a system where accountability was nearly impossible. She and her team began reaching out to people who had been caught in this system: doctors, nurses, architects, business owners, many of whom had felt powerless and alone. Their stories were heartbreaking but also vital. They spoke of lost jobs, damaged reputations, and the emotional toll of being unfairly targeted. These testimonies became the backbone of the case. It wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about decades of systematic abuse affecting hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Behind the scenes, she coordinated with federal agencies to open parallel investigations. They secured search warrants, froze assets tied to the police foundation suspected of laundering money, and monitored internal communications. Every discovery revealed deeper layers of corruption, officers receiving payments to look the other way, judges influencing case assignments, and union leaders shielding their own from scrutiny. She also worked closely with community leaders and advocacy groups. Together, they began organizing support for victims and raising awareness about the problem. Public pressure grew, making it harder for officials to ignore the mounting evidence. Despite the growing momentum, the opposition fought back fiercely. Defense lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence, delay hearings, and discredit witnesses. Police unions launched media campaigns portraying the accused officers as dedicated public servants unfairly targeted. The judge who had once dismissed her motions now showed his bias openly, pushing to keep bail high and trials moving slowly. But she was prepared for this. Years in courtrooms had taught her how to navigate these tactics. She kept meticulous records of every unfair ruling, every delayed hearing, every act of intimidation. These would become powerful tools to expose the system's true nature. Her team also uncovered internal training materials used by the police department, documents that taught officers how to fabricate probable cause, manipulate evidence, and pressure suspects into plea deals. The materials used coded language to hide the racial targeting, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just corruption. It was institutionalized racism disguised as policing. The more evidence they gathered, the clearer it became. This was a criminal enterprise operating under the guise of law enforcement, and she was at the center of exposing it. She stayed connected with the women from the holding cell, who had become more than just victims. They were now allies and voices for change. Some had agreed to testify, others shared new stories, adding to the growing mountain of proof. Every interview, every document, every detail was cataloged and stored securely. She made sure multiple copies existed, hidden away in case anyone tried to destroy the evidence. Her resolve was unwavering. She had chosen to face this injustice not just for herself, but for every person who had been harmed by a system that should have protected them. Building this case took time and courage. It meant facing threats, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But with each step forward, the corrupt system grew weaker, and the hope for real justice grew stronger. This was no longer just about one arrest. It was about tearing down a network of corruption, demanding accountability, and making sure that no one else would have to suffer the way she and so many others had. And she was ready for whatever came next. The day of the courtroom showdown arrived like the calm before a storm. After weeks of collecting evidence, gathering testimonies, and facing endless delays, she was finally ready to confront the corrupt system head-on. The courtroom buzzed quietly with anticipation, a place where power, truth, and justice would collide. As she walked into the courtroom, the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. This was more than just a trial. It was a reckoning. She wasn't just a defendant or a prosecutor anymore. She was a symbol of the fight against a system that had long operated in the shadows, protected by fear and silence. The judge took his seat, his face stern and unreadable. The officers who had once held power over her sat in the front row, their confident expressions betraying nothing. Yet, the prosecutor assigned to the case adjusted his tie with a smug smile, ready to defend the very corruption she was about to expose. The opening statements were a familiar dance of words. The prosecutor painted her as a troublemaker, someone who had resisted lawful authority and endangered public safety. The judge nodded along, seemingly prepared to uphold the charges with little scrutiny. But when it was her turn to speak, everything changed. Rising slowly, she stepped forward and addressed the court with a calm but commanding voice. "Before we proceed, there is something the court needs to know," she began. "I am not just a defendant in this case. I am a United States attorney for this district. The room fell silent. Eyes widened. The murmurs started in the back of the courtroom. The judge's expression shifted from indifference to shock. The officers in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances, and the prosecutor's confident smile faltered. She continued, laying out the evidence she and her team had gathered: the fabricated charges, the false reports, the abuse of power by the ET, officers and their allies in the prosecutor's office and on the bench. She detailed how she had been deliberately targeted and arrested as part of a much larger pattern of misconduct. As she spoke, FBI agents quietly entered the courtroom, positioning themselves strategically around the room. Their presence was a powerful reminder that this was no longer just a local case. It was a federal investigation with serious consequences. The judge tried to interrupt, but she held firm. This case is about more than just me. It's about exposing a system that has allowed corruption, racism, and abuse of power to flourish for far too long. The prosecutor stammered, clearly caught off guard. The officers shifted uncomfortably, no longer the confident enforcers of the law, but exposed as perpetrators of injustice. Soon after, the courtroom doors opened and agents moved to arrest the corrupt officers and officials. Handcuffs clicked, as those who had abused their positions were taken into custody. The judge's gavel trembled in his hand, his authority crumbling under the weight of the truth. This moment was a turning point. What had started as an unjust traffic stop had transformed into a powerful exposure of corruption at the highest levels. The system that once seemed untouchable was finally being held accountable. She sat back down, exhausted but triumphant. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be more court battles, investigations, and resistance. But for the first time, real justice was within reach. The courtroom showdown wasn't just a personal victory. It was a signal to all those who had suffered in silence. The fight for justice was alive, and the corrupt could no longer hide behind their badges and robes. This day marked the beginning of real change, one that would ripple through the justice system and beyond. The courtroom showdown sent shockwaves through the entire justice system, but the real work was only just beginning. The moment the corrupt officers and officials were arrested, a door opened wide to uncover a deeper, more disturbing truth. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person whose life had been shattered by this corrupt network. The investigation expanded rapidly, revealing layers of deceit, cover-ups, and abuse that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. Financial records showed how a secret police foundation funneled money through shell companies, rewarding officers who played along and silencing those who spoke out. Judges received hidden payments in exchange for favorable rulings. Prosecutors who buried evidence were protecting their own careers and pensions. She worked closely with federal agents and civil rights lawyers, coordinating raids on police departments and judicial offices. Files were seized, emails scrutinized, and bank accounts frozen. Each discovery added new pieces to the puzzle, painting a clear picture of a system rigged to protect corruption. But exposing this corruption was about more than just arrests and paperwork. She knew that true justice meant supporting the victims, the doctors, nurses, teachers, business owners, whose careers and reputations had been damaged. Many had taken plea deals just to avoid months or years in jail, losing jobs and livelihoods in the process. Together with community leaders and advocacy groups, she helped establish a support network. Victims could share their stories, access legal aid, and begin to rebuild their lives. It was a slow, painful process, but a necessary one. The media caught wind of the unfolding scandal, and public outcry grew. People demanded accountability, transparency, and change. The pressure forced local and state governments to act, implementing reforms like mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight boards, and new training programs focused on de-escalation and bias reduction. She was there every step of the way, pushing, for systemic reforms, testifying before legislative committees, and working with police chiefs committed to real change. It wasn't easy. Old power structures resisted fiercely, trying to discredit her and slow the reforms. But the momentum was unstoppable. Convictions were overturned for hundreds of wrongfully accused people. Prosecutors who had participated in the cover-up faced disciplinary actions, including disbarment. Judges who had abused their positions were removed from the bench. She watched as communities once distrustful of law enforcement began to engage in meaningful dialogue. Officers who opposed corruption found their voices and started demanding accountability from within their departments. The fight was no longer just legal, it was cultural. Changing hearts and minds was the real challenge, and she was determined to help lead that change. Late at night, after long days filled with meetings and court appearances, she often reflected on her journey. The injustice she faced firsthand had been painful, but it had given her a unique perspective and a powerful voice. She had chosen to become a victim to expose the villains, knowing that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is the courage to experience it. She thought about the women she'd met in the holding cell, the victims who had become allies and advocates. Their resilience inspired her every day. Together, they were building something new, a justice system rooted in fairness, respect, and equality. While the old system still lingered in some places, the cracks were growing, wider. The corrupt network was unraveling piece by piece, and a new era was beginning. She knew the fight wasn't over. Real justice would take time, effort, and unwavering commitment. But she was ready, because this was about more than one case. It was about changing a system that had betrayed so many for too long, and now, finally, it was starting to change. After months of relentless investigation, courtroom battles, and tireless advocacy, the winds of change finally began to sweep through the city. What had started as a late-night traffic stop and an unjust arrest transformed into a movement that shook the very foundation of the justice system. The woman at the center of it all, the federal prosecutor who had chosen to endure the system's worst treatment to expose its darkest secrets, now stood as a symbol of courage and hope. She had faced the full weight of injustice, but instead of breaking, she became a force for real change. The reforms she fought for were no longer just ideas on paper. Police departments adopted new policies. Body cameras became mandatory, civilian oversight boards gained real authority, and training programs focused on respect, fairness, and understanding replaced outdated and harmful methods. Judges and prosecutors implicated in the scandal faced consequences. Some lost their positions. Others were disbarred or faced criminal charges. It was a clear message. Abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. More importantly, the victims, doctors, nurses, teachers, business owners, everyday people, began to reclaim their lives. Wrongful convictions were overturned, records expunged, and support programs helped repair careers and relationships damaged by years of unfair treatment. Communities once distrustful of law enforcement started to rebuild bridges. Town hall meetings, community policing initiatives, and honest conversations became the new norm. The woman often visited these gatherings, listening to stories, offering support, and reminding everyone that justice was a shared responsibility. Behind the scenes, her team continued to dig deeper. The corruption they uncovered was widespread, touching neighboring cities and even reaching state levels. Federal task forces coordinated with local offices, sharing evidence and strategies to dismantle similar networks elsewhere. Despite the victories, she knew the work was far from over. Changing a system that had been broken for decades would take patience, persistence, and collective effort. But the path forward was clearer than ever. Reflecting on her journey, she understood the power of her choice to stay silent about her identity during that first stop, to experience the system from the inside, and to document every injustice. It was a risky path, filled with uncertainty and hardship, but it was the key to exposing a system that had seemed untouchable. She thought often about the women she met in the holding cell. Their strength and resilience fueled her determination. Their voices, once silenced, now echoed through courtrooms, media, and reform meetings. Together, they had turned pain into power. The city was changing. The justice system was slowly transforming into what it was always meant to be: a place of fairness, equality, and truth, no longer a shield for the powerful and a trap for the vulnerable. As she stood by her office window one evening, watching the city lights twinkle below, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but also a quiet resolve. This was only the beginning. Real justice required constant vigilance and courage. She knew many battles still lay ahead, new cases to fight, new voices to hear, and new barriers to break. But for the first time in a long time, she believed in a future where justice served everyone equally, regardless of their race, status, or wealth. The system had shown its worst face during her week in custody. Now it was showing its best side, a side shaped by truth, accountability, and hope. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floors as she left the courthouse that night, each step echoing the promise of a better tomorrow. The old power structures lay in ruins, replaced by a movement fueled by courage and justice. And as she walked into the night, she carried with her the stories of countless people who had suffered, fought back, and ultimately helped build something new. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it, because real justice isn't just about punishment. It's about healing, reform, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness. And this was the story of one woman's courage to stand up, speak out, and change the system from the inside. A story that reminds us all: justice is possible when we are willing to fight for it.